Hello everyone. It's getting close to Christmas and a lot of us are decorating our Christmas trees. But when you decorate your Christmas tree and you put the ornaments on, do you ever put a spider ornament on your tree? Not very many people do, unless you live in Ukraine. The children of Ukraine do put spider ornaments on their Christmas trees, and I'd like to tell you the story about why they do that. A long time ago, in a very small village, there was a widow who had 4 children. This widow worked by sewing. She was a tailor, and she made beautiful dresses and fancy suits for people, and she made enough money to make sure that her children had food. And the way that she made sure that her children had new clothes was she would take the pieces of that fabric that weren't needed when she made the beautiful clothes, and she would take those scraps and she would sew clothes for her children too. And you know how sometimes when you're putting together a project, you have lots of leftovers, and some of them are big pieces and you can use them for later, and some of them are really small and you can't use them for very much. The little tiny pieces she would give to her children, and the children would take those little pieces of fabric and they would make little toys for themselves or something fun, like maybe a hacky sack type of ball or something. Now, they lived in a pretty small house right on the edge of the woods. And their land was small. They had a little backyard, and most of the backyard they'd made into a garden to grow food for themselves in the summertime. And they had a tiny little front yard, just a little front yard. And they didn't have any trees on their property. Now, they were next to the forest, so they could see lots of beautiful pine trees. And at Christmas time, they never had enough money to buy one of those trees, to have somebody go over to one of the landowners and ask to buy one of their trees. But the oldest girl, who was about maybe 9 or 10 years old, she was on her way home from school one day, and she saw a pine cone that the squirrels had missed. And there were still pine nut seeds in that pine cone. And she knew if she planted it, it could grow into a pine tree. And she was really excited. And she planted that right in front of their house in that tiny little front yard. And of course, it hadn't grown by that Christmas, but she knew that if over time it would grow and they would have their own Christmas tree. Well, the most amazing thing happened, okay? It was a fantastically warm spring for Ukraine. Usually it's pretty cold in Ukraine for all but just a few months of the year, but it was so warm. It was so nice. And do you know that little pine tree sprouted and it just started to grow like crazy? And all summer it was toasty warm, and the children made sure that the pine tree got lots and lots of water, and they took care of it and they protected it from other animals and things that might want to eat it. And it just grew. It grew so much, and they couldn't believe how much it grew. It got wonderful weather, and there was a long fall. That pine tree actually grew to be about like this big. It was actually as tall as the littlest child in their family. That was great. Now, it was a little tree, but they knew if they saved those tiny scraps that were made by their mom, leaving little projects and not being able to use all the little pieces that she cut off of the fabric when she made patterns for the fancy clothes, if they saved all those scraps, they could sew them into Christmas ornaments. And the ornaments would be light and really, really easy for the tiny little tree to hold up, so it wouldn't hurt the little tree. And they could have an actual, factual Christmas tree. Now, so far, I've told you what these children didn't have. They didn't have much money at all. They didn't have a lot of toys. They didn't have, very fancy things, and they just had a little yard to play in. And their dad was gone, he had died protecting their country, and they didn't have a lot. But you know what they did have? They had more than they didn't have. This was a super kind family. These children were so kind and so nice to each other that they almost never argued. They almost never fought. They were so calm and sweet, and they would help each other, and they would help their neighbors, and they were always thinking about other people. As a matter of fact, they knew how busy their mom was sewing, so guess who ended up doing most of the housework? It was the 4 children. They did. And those 4 children, they were so nice that when they were cleaning the house and sweeping the floor, if they found a spider, what do you think they did? Did they squish it? Did they throw it outside? No, they didn't. They thought, oh, it's cold outside, poor little spider. And so they'd take the spider and they very carefully put it in another part of their house so it would be safe. Pretty amazing, right? Not very many people are that kind. And the spiders paid them back by helping them too. They used to eat the fleas and the bed bugs and all the other bugs that we don't usually have to deal with very much today. But that was a big problem in the olden days. And those spiders, they would sit and eat all those bugs so that the children didn't get bitten by them in the night. It was a pretty good deal. But the spiders wished they could do more because these were super kind children. Now, what happened as the time grew closer to Christmas is the children were able to gather some really pretty fabric. Their mom was making Christmas dresses for all the more wealthy people in the village and in the city nearby. And she was making really fancy suits for the gentlemen, and this was some really nice cloth. And they were getting little pretty scraps of gold and silver and beautiful bright jewel colors, and they were so excited about the ornaments they were going to make. But these were really kind children, and they found out something. They found out that a family in the house nearby was going to have a baby. And while the people in town had been very kind and had shared their old baby clothes that their children couldn't fit anymore, so they had lots of clothes for their new baby, they didn't have a blanket to wrap that baby in. Not one blanket. These were super kind children. I bet you can guess what they did. They took all those beautiful, warm scraps of clothes and fabric, and they made the most beautiful, soft, comfy, warm blanket that a baby could ever want. And they brought it to that family and gave it to them for Christmas. And they felt really good about it. I mean, they weren't even disappointed that they weren't going to be able to make their Christmas ornaments. They were happy. They wanted to help. But you know who wasn't happy? The spiders. They weren't happy one bit. They were actually really upset because they were going, these are the nicest children in like the world. And they're always so kind to us. And now they won't have any ornaments on their little tree. And they worked so hard to take care of that tree all year. And they worked so hard to gather all those fabric scraps. And it's not fair. And so you know what the spiders did? They had a meeting the night before Christmas, on Christmas Eve. They gathered in the attic and they had a meeting. And they discussed what they could do to decorate the Christmas tree for the children. No spider had ever done that before, and they weren't really sure how, but they were going to do it. And they all trooped together. They went down the stairs, across the old wood floor, underneath the door, and out into the snow. And it was very cold. It was really cold for little spiders, and they had to be quick so they didn't freeze. So they ran over to the tree, and they started making the most beautiful tiny webs they could make. And they started going around and around the tree with spider silk garlands from the bottom all the way to the very top. And they would do little drop downs and little things like icicles and glitter. It was beautiful. They did such a good job. And now they were so cold, they could barely feel their little feet. So they hurried back inside and they got into the house and they went upstairs to the attic and they looked out the window. And they could hardly wait until Christmas morning came and the children saw the tree. But then something they did not expect happened. fog rolled in. There's almost no fog in the middle of the winter in Ukraine. That shouldn't have happened, and it was thick fog too. The spiders couldn't even see the tree from the window. Ah, that's not what they wanted. What a mess. And the fog just kind of stayed, and they thought, this is terrible. The children will never even know we decorated that beautiful tree for them. And then the sun came out, and you know what? That fog melted away, and the spiders saw a miracle. Because that whole tree that had been covered with spider webs and spider silk had been touched by the fog, and the fog had frozen into millions of tiny sparkly crystals on every single web and every single strand of silk. And that little tree looked like it had been covered in diamonds. It was the most beautiful thing the spiders had ever seen. And when the children woke up that morning, they went out to sing Christmas carols around their little tree like they planned to do. And when they saw that tree, they could not believe their eyes. It was the most sparkly, glittery, beautifully decorated tree that had ever existed or would ever exist in the world. All because they were so kind. And that's why the children of Ukraine put spiders on their Christmas tree, to remind themselves of the day when the spiders made a miracle happen. Have a wonderful Christmas, you guys. Bye-bye.